Hi, good afternoon, and welcome back to the session on reflective teaching. So today we are going to discuss Learning Outcome 2, which is continuing from what we did in terms of discussions yesterday on reflective practice. Now, in the Learning Outcome 2, the assessment criteria talks about know how to reflect on your own education and training practice. So this particular learning outcome is going to be looking at doing a reflection on your own teaching practices in the environment or in the particular setup that you are teaching. So here there are 4 assessment criteria. We're looking at current performance requirements. We're looking at understanding different rules that can be used for looking at reflective practice and reflective teaching. We'll be looking at analyzing the importance of using feedback forms from different sources in terms of how it would inform the feedback that we take. How does it inform, like, for example, peer observation, teaching observation. We look at feedback from learners, feedback from your coordinator or your program manager. Then the idea would be to try and understand what is the importance of using the feedback which comes from different sources and how we can use it to improve our reflective practice. And the last assessment criteria is going to be focused on assessing the extent to which your own practice is inclusive. That means when we talk about inclusivity, we are looking at inclusive teaching and learning. And when we do talk about inclusive teaching and learning, what we mean by that is that how do you recognize that all students are entitled to a learning experience that reflects their diversity, and obviously that enables participation. How does your teaching practice actually remove any barriers, and how do you anticipate or consider a variety of different learning needs and preferences when you're teaching and delivering in a classroom or a classroom-like setting like online. So there are a fair bit of assessment criteria to be covered in Learning Outcome 2. We're going to be looking at some of the indicative content which has been given here. And what I will do is obviously look at discussing this with the use of a PowerPoint presentation. This presentation you should be able to have on Moodle. It's already all preloaded. And what we're going to do is discuss and go through some of the slides with regards to covering the key aspects involved in reflecting on our own education and teaching practice, and in general look at the 4 assessment criteria. So let's dive into the key terminology. The key terminology that we want to look at in this case is looking at how do we reflect on our own education and learning practice. So here, when we look at this particular aspect of your own education, here you're going to be asking questions to yourself and also self-assessing that how would you look at your strength areas, what are your areas that you need to develop, or what are the areas in which you need training or further skill development. And then reflecting would primarily mean that you're allowing yourself to understand how you're going to be helping others to achieve, and how this would pan out when you start delivering in an environment like in a classroom, in terms of how would that practically, kind of pan out when you're actually delivering in a classroom. So when we look at reflecting on one's education, we're going to start by obviously looking at questioning ourselves, and that questioning that you're going to do is going to be based on your own teaching and teaching expertise and experience. And when we look at those reflections, you're going to be looking at, maybe doing a SWOT analysis. And this SWOT analysis would allow you to essentially look at, going into areas of your strength, your weaknesses, what are the areas that you see opportunities for yourself, and what are the areas that you feel they would be, posing threats or challenges to you when you're actually teaching and delivering in a classroom or online or any sort of a setting. Now, the bits that we look at when we look at this aspect of how do we reflect on our own education and training practices, to primarily look at creating what is called a reflective journal. And this journal is used to record your thoughts, your experiences, and your observations. Normally, this is something that we, recommend early in the early stages in, high school in the UK, and you would be seen, you would see that, all teachers and tutors, what form tutors essentially would ask students, to basically maintain a journal or a diary in which they make record of their let's say they make records of their thoughts, their experiences, and their observation. And this journal actually serves as a valuable resource when you're looking at ongoing reflection. That means you're looking at, continuously using the process of correcting yourself, adapting yourself in terms of delivering, teaching and learning in a classroom. Now, there are obviously theoretical frameworks that we've looked at that can be applied, the CLOB cycle, the experiential, cycle, CLOB cycle. Then we look at the 4 areas or quadrants of learning, concrete experience, reflective learning, abstract conceptualization, and then putting it to experience. These would be useful when you do that process or use that process of, reflective learning. Now, typically in a setting, when you're, in a classroom-based setting or when you're working within an organization, what you're generally going to see is that peer observations and feedback tend to be one of the, best possible routes through which you are able to do reflection on your own practice. And they tend to be from colleagues or mentors or, your program managers or supervisors. And peer observations can provide diverse perspective on how your teaching practice is, because they are looked at by your peers, people who work alongside you, and they would be looking at giving you feedback. Then there are other regular reviews that you're a part of as a teacher, as a tutor, as an instructor, as a lecturer within the institution that you work. And these regular reviews tend to be slated quarterly or 6 monthly or annually. And these reviews are basically done, which are done primarily through what are called teaching observations. So in the UK, obviously, when you look at Ofsted teaching observation grading scale, what typically tends to happen is that, most, teachers would at least go through some sort of, let's say teaching observations throughout the year. And these teaching observations primarily tend to be, based on, 4 basic criteria, which is outstanding, good, requires improvement, and unsatisfactory. So grade 1 to 4, 1 being the best, 4 being the lowest or unsatisfactory. And that is something that I would suggest that you should be aware of. And this is something which I can, obviously share with you very briefly, is an additional document that I would, ask you to go in and at some stage, look at that document. And this document, which is uploaded now onto Moodle, would basically give you the Ofsted grading criteria of what constitutes outstanding, what constitutes as being good, and what constitutes as requiring improvement or, non-satisfactory or unsatisfactory. So these are bits that you have to look at when you look at, the aspect of, your own reflection in terms of your teaching practice. Now, the other bits that you can look at in terms of how this would happen is that you regularly look at identifying learning objectives, which is making changes to your learning plan, your schemes of work, and obviously having clearly defined objectives would allow you to essentially do, improvements or make changes. And that would also be looking at as a process of, doing a reflection on, or basically an evaluation of how you teach in a classroom-based setting or in any particular setting. And then the last aspect that I would say is obviously when you look at identifying your areas of strengths and areas of improvement, what you have to put into place is what is called a continuous improvement plan or an action plan. And this tends to be generally through a process called the personal development plan. When you set goals for your professional growth, you take action, and then you undertake a set of activities that you're going to do and undertake. And these activities or training essentially would allow you systematically to improve your weakness areas or development of certain areas. And this in general, in turn, would allow you to do what is called enhanced teaching, and your teaching over a point in time would start to become more effective and more, aligned or oriented towards the goals and objectives set in the curriculum planning. So when we look at our own area of how do we reflect on education and training practice, these tend to be journal steps, things like regular reviews, peer observations, teaching observations, looking at a reflective journal, and then also looking at doing your own SWOT and developing a PDP, which will help you keep track of how and where or what are the areas in which you need to make improvements to be able to teach and deliver effectively in a classroom or a classroom type setting. Now, when we look at most of these, it is important for us to also, keep in mind that some of these practices that we look at in terms of evaluation and reflection tend to be also informed from our academic background in terms of the qualifications that you have and the academic or vocational qualifications you have and the number of years of experience or working within this particular sector. Now, there's a particular video that I've shortlisted, which basically shows how advanced practitioners actually look at reflections and what is involved in making self-reflections in order to identify current performance and requirements to check on your own practice. So this is a video which I would suggest that you watch offline. It's an 8 or 9 minute video, which is a presentation by Beta Barker. And she's an advanced practitioner, and she shares some of her thoughts in terms of how advanced reflections can be made by practitioners who are working within the higher education or, in the secondary school sector. Now, with this understanding, let's go into some of the assessment criteria, which are going to be more or less related to understanding our own reflection on our own education and our own practice. The first one talks about identifying, current performance requirements relevant to your practice. Now here, this is something which is a practical bit, and I would suggest it this way that, I'll take the example of, in my own case, I would take the example of how do I look at identifying my own performance and relate it to the practice. So in my case, it is a case of looking at how do I look at taking feedback from the teaching observations, which are done, in my case, by the quality manager and the head of compliance. And then how do I look at taking feedback from the course surveys, which are normally served to the students, and students essentially would provide feedback on my on the process of teaching and learning. And this would inform me the areas in which I need to improve, or areas in which I would need to make changes to my practice, which is primarily make changes in my lesson planning, so that it allows the lessons to be more interactive. It allows the lessons to have more activities. I would be able to look at doing a bit of an introspection in terms of the resources that I use to be able to teach and deliver some of my subject areas or sessions, or conduct my sessions. And last but not the least, the peer observations, which are done by my colleagues, typically inform me that what are things that I'm doing good, what are things that I'm not doing so good, and what are areas of areas in my teaching and learning essentially we need improvement, or I need to do a bit of training, and that would allow me to equip my teaching methodology to be equipped with tools and techniques that can be used to deliver more interactive, more engaging, and obviously more sessions which are aligned with the learning objectives of any particular unit, or in this case, say for example, the teaching of teaching of the content that I'm doing. So how does this get informed? In general, we look at policies and procedures and guidelines which have been set. I look at my own job description. So if I'm the course director, for some of the courses and in certain subject areas, then I look at my job description. What are the key responsibilities that I have? What are those responsibilities asking me to fulfill? And then apart from that, I look at what are the policies and procedures that I can make use of in terms of effectively delivering on those roles and responsibilities. I need to do some CPD, which is my own professional development, to be remaining abreast of industry trends and best practices. So for example, I receive a lot of newsletters which come in from different awarding bodies like ATHE, OTHM, NCFE, Pearson, and I normally go through those newsletters and updates which are introduced by these awarding bodies, and I use those updates to keep my knowledge up to date with regards to what changes are happening in my subject areas. And at the same time, I use those to also create and generate interaction with other colleagues in different organizations to keep myself updated on some of the key industry trends which are happening, or developments which are happening in that field, in the field of, say, business management and strategic management and leadership in particular. Then I also look at feedback and evaluation as a process. When I have annual appraisals, when teaching observations are done, when we have sometimes officer inspectors doing teaching observations of my teaching, and I use the feedback which is received from them to be able to inform and make changes to my preparation, delivery, organization of resources, and the preparation of activities that I do, which makes these sessions more engaging and interactive with learners. Now, the course surveys which are normally done help me also understand what are the expectations of my students and learners essentially on different courses. And I take into account their feedback in terms of On a Likert scale, normally these surveys are generally starting with strongly disagree to strongly agree. And what I would do is there are a series of set questions which are served to the learners, and these learners that I'm teaching on certain courses would then feedback on whether the teaching is the questions related to teaching, questions related to material, questions related to engagement and interaction, and then learning, which is happening with regards to completing the learning objectives and meeting the learning objectives of that unit or of that course. And they are some bits and pieces that I get from, looking into course surveys, which are predominantly, meeting students' expectations, in my case, as a teacher. And then I also look at reflecting on my own personal and professional goals. So over the years, when I started off as a teacher. Then I slowly and gradually, after a number of years of experience, got into the role of a program manager. And then after a number of years of working as a program manager for business, strategic management, health and social care management, IT courses, I then became a course director. And this is looking at my professional growth related to the aspect of teaching and learning, and how my teaching practice is helping me develop further in my career. And these are bits that you will have to look at identifying from a point of view of covering the first assessment criteria, which is identifying your current performance requirements and relevant and related to your own area of practice. Now, I would suggest that you could do up a table here, and that table would essentially be a table which basically informs your current requirements. So maybe take your job description, which from the organization, if you're working within an organization, have your job description ready. And that job description would essentially be describing your roles and responsibilities, and then have a SWOT analysis that you can do. And that would allow you to identify your strengths and weakness areas or areas for development. And then using that, I would suggest that you look at constructing a PDP, which could be in a tabular form. And if I show you an example of a PDP, that PDP would have a list of activities that you're looking at. And, essentially, I would put it this way, a list of activities that you're essentially looking at completing every year. And those set of activities that you're looking at completing would essentially allow you to, let's say, develop areas that you feel are lacking, or areas in which you have, I would say, you do not have up-to-date information. And those areas would essentially be, useful for you, primarily because they are going to be required from a point of view of development. And when we talk about from a point of view of development, that means you're going to be going into what is called training and development, and that would inform, essentially you in terms of your developments that you need to achieve. So if I just briefly show you, say, for example, a CPD template, that template allows me to keep track of the activities that I'm doing over a point in time. And these activities essentially, then help me reflect on my practice and essentially allow me to become a better and effective teacher, essentially. And they are bits and pieces that I keep adding to, keep reviewing, and they are normally something that I keep track of on a yearly basis. So, for example, I teach Pearson courses, and obviously look at my CPD on this side. Then I look at CPD, which is primarily done on other courses that I teach and deliver, and the trainings that I do, or reading a book that I do, or I go on external trainings. And this is going to be helping me, better my teaching side of things, equip myself with greater tools and techniques to be able to teach effectively and deliver some of the sessions that I do online more effectively. And this is an ongoing process. So it's not a destination, it's an ongoing journey that you keep reviewing, keep updating, and keep adding to the activities that you're looking at doing. And they would basically be helping you improve your teaching and learning, and thereby give you a very clear idea of how you look at your own practice. So I hope this bit is clear. Any questions on this assessment criteria, feel free to ask me as we go along. Now, the second one talks about evaluate different tools for you, which you can use for reflective teaching. Now, this is something that I gave you a brief idea of early when we did the introduction in terms of how do we do and reflect on our own practices and education. So reflective practice, tools that we look at as a teacher, as a lecturer, as an instructor, as a guide, or as a tutor, they tend to be use of journals, wherein you're keeping a clear, concise, let's say, a documentation on, the bits and pieces of your experiences, your thoughts, and in this case, also looking at, your own things that you do well, the things that you don't do well, and in some cases, things that you feel could have been done better. And those are the ones that you would look at primarily, essentially documenting them in the, let's say, your journals. So this is something that I also encourage some of my colleagues to do, is to keep a journal, and that would, record some of the key bits when you're teaching and learning, when you're delivering. It helps you record some of the key events, challenges, or situations that you've faced, and that allows you to do a bit of reflection towards the end of the year when we do annual reviews. Now, you could also look at lesson reflection template. That means sometimes for certain sessions that you do, you have predefined templates and this a classic example that I would give in this case is when we have offset visits, and obviously when they look at doing teaching observation, the first thing that I have to do is give the offset inspector a sample of my the lesson plan essentially on that day that they're going to be observing my teaching, and also give them a copy of the presentation or a summary of the activities that I planned for delivery during that session. And using them, they can then evaluate by using that, lesson plan template which I've given them and the preparation document that I've given them. They can actually evaluate in terms of how effective as a teacher I am, and how do I look at engaging, delivering, make use of resources, and ensure that the sessions that I teach and deliver are interactive. So this tends to be a lesson reflection template as an example I've given you. And here what you will do is basically that lesson planning template would have things like the aims and objectives of what you're trying to deliver on that day and achieve in the session. It'll have your instructional strategies, it'll have your lesson objectives, it'll have resources that you're going to be utilizing, and a list of activities or different assessment methods that you're going to be using to primarily look at delivering the session. Then you have peer observations, as I mentioned, and feedback. And this is a very valuable tool because it allows your peers and your colleagues to essentially observe you in classroom-based settings, and then provide you feedback on your teaching practices. And this could be a very valuable tool to help you understand and gain and improve and adapt. I'm using some quite heavy words like gain and adapt, or use and adapt or change your teaching practices to suit the needs of your learners, thereby making your teaching, interactive and engaging. Then we have what are called video and audio recordings. These video and audio recordings tend to be allowing teachers to review their instructional practices and the interaction that they do with the students when they're delivering sessions. And this is basically done predominantly through the use of recordings that we have to do, and they can be then used to make improvements or learn lessons from how in some situations or challenges we have to adapt to making sure that the learners are comfortable and your students are comfortable in terms of meeting those objectives. We also have what is called reflective blogs and online platforms, and these tend to be in larger organizations. When you look at Twinkle, TWIKL, which is a platform which teachers look at. There are other platforms which are online, which is teachers.net in the UK. And here teachers normally interact and obviously share resources and, let's say say for example share their practices, and this allows for a broader level of reflections to happen within the community. For example, you might be a biology teacher, you might be a mathematics teacher, you might be an English teacher, and in those cases interacting on certain such forums and platforms would allow you to get a broader perspective and or maybe broader feedback in terms of your practices for teaching and learning, and they could be quite useful for you in the long run to helping you better and improve your own teaching practice. Then we have professional learning communities. You are sometimes part and parcel of certain chartered bodies like the Institute of Learning, IFL, You look at the ETF, which is the Education and Training Foundation, and these institutes and professional training outfits, essentially people, take memberships of these, and because they have similar interests, you are basically networking on a broader level, and that allows you to share your own experiences and obviously engage with other such like-minded colleagues to be able to, develop your own teaching practice or get a reflection on your own teaching practice. You have mentorship programs in certain places, obviously within schools. If you are working as a teacher and at some stage you've been doing quite well over the years, you might have a succession plan wherein you're looking at becoming a head teacher of a school. So in some cases, as reviews happen and you're identified to take up that position, maybe you'd be asked to deputize. And in some cases, this deputization tends to take the form of coaching and mentoring. And mentoring tends to be when you work directly under the guidance and supervision of an experienced person to be able to gain valuable skills and experience of stepping into that role at a later stage. And that would be the usefulness of mentoring. Data analysis and assessment tends to continuously be done nowadays, keeping in mind that some part of your reflection and feedback tends to be a process wherein it is data driven. Course surveys, exit interviews, reviews, feedback from the larger community or fraternity are normally used to basically look at let's say evaluating your teaching practice. And in those cases, data analysis is a key aspect of how you would go about using different tools to look at your own teaching and then make a reflection on or get into a reflection of that. So combining multiple tools and strategies essentially can help you have a comprehensive approach on reflective teaching, and obviously enabling you to gain valuable insights which would allow you to adjust your instructional strategies or look at your wider professional growth on a long-term and a continuous basis. So any questions on this assessment criteria, please let me know. The next one that we look at is the analysis of importance of using feedback from different sources. Now, you have to look at that basically some of the assessment criteria being covered today in Learning Outcome 2 might have the same meaning at the end of the day. So in the previous one, we looked at evaluating different tools, but essentially the key word was different tools to look at reflective teaching. Here, in this assessment criteria, we're looking at the importance of these tools which provide you feedback, and then how do you use them from different sources to inform your own reflective practice. So we went into the different tools, and here the importance of feedback gathered from these tools is being done in this assessment criteria. So you can see how closely and how finely they are linked. So you need to be able to differentiate. Now, when we look at feedback from different sources, it is important for us to understand how they are going to be, adding value to our teaching practice. Whether sometimes all this feedback from different sources might not be useful at all because it might not relate to your subject area, or it might not be useful because it might be irrelevant from a point of view of how you're looking at your own teaching practice in terms of reflection on your teaching practice. So sometimes when we look at the importance of this feedback, the importance of feedback comes from, it allows us to get, what does it allow us to get? What do you get from feedback? When you take feedback from somebody in general, you're looking at somebody's perspective on what their take is and how do they look at this particular problem, challenge, or this situation. So one of the things which comes across when we take feedback is a different perspective or a diverse perspective. So here, taking opinion or feedback, feedback from different people would allow you to have a comprehensive understanding of how people see you and your teaching practices in regards to your teaching and delivery. The second aspect that we want to look at is objective assessment. So when you look at different forms of assessment, one of the clear things that you look at in the assessment from an external point of view would be that how do you validate and look at the assumptions that you have which inform your lesson planning, or how do you look at the assumptions that you make and how they are relevant to the overall goals and objectives of the curriculum or the subject area that you're delivering. So in this case, sometimes when you look at taking feedback, the importance of taking feedback is to inform you that you are on course and keeping into view or taking into view the objectives and goals which are set as per the broader curriculum that your learners need to achieve, and that is what will inform you better when you look at your own lesson planning. Then we also look at student-centered approach. We look at professional growth and development, and we look at targeted areas for improvement. Now, student-centered approach is become quite important in today's context, is because most teachers, when they look at student-centered approach, we look at this from a point of view of student-centered approach for learning. That means what we want to do is make sure that we are giving every student the opportunity to decide on a couple of things. One, what material they would use to learn from, and how would they do the learning from it. So this concept is sometimes also referred to as what is called personalized learning. So in contrast, sometimes when we look at teacher-centered approaches or TCA, what we do is in most places and organizations today, the TCA has been is not a preferred route, but the student-centered learning, or SCL, is a preferred route because it engages the students and it allows them to make decisions with regards to how they would go about choosing the resources, looking at the medium, and in terms of how they would look at the pedagogical frameworks to be able to then use creative thinking and their own decision making to learn in a particular environment or to learn in a particular setting. So student-centered approach tends to include things like active student involvement. We are focused on individualized learning. That is where the process or the concept of individual learning plan comes in, because no two students are the same. Everyone is different, and in some cases, one of the activities or weakness areas of the student could be a strength area of the other, and that is why we also look at the individual learning plan. And then when we look at student-centered approach, one of the key things that comes across from that approach is that it also helps develop what is called collaborative learning. And here students often work collaboratively in activities which would allow them to have peer interactions. And this would mean that they have a better understanding of the subject matter. Sometimes my saying something to you might not make sense, but if you have a discussion with one of the other learners on the course or ask and do, let's say, engage in interactions, then sometimes the perspective can come across quite easily, or you can understand that subject or that topic quite easily. And that tends to be through the process of, collaborative learning. And when we talk about, teachers as facilitators, it's not teacher-centric, it is student-centric. So what we see our role as is that teachers tend to be facilitators. That means our role is to help shift being the primary source of knowledge in the classroom. My role is to help shift that primary source of knowledge to the student and act as a facilitator, which allows them to gain knowledge from you in the process of the teaching and learning journey. So we look at lots and lots of different usages of feedback when we get feedback from different sources which inform our reflective practice. Now, it could also include points like enhanced self-awareness, building collaborative relationship. Again, a point that I've just made, which is to look at not just with students, but also to look at building collaborative relationships with other members in different communities or different, let's say, places. And this would be, essentially useful because this would allow you to get a broader perspective or understanding of the broader perspective in terms of how things are in play. When we look at different schools, for example, they teach the same curriculum in the UK, but when we look at the standards, the performance metrics, and how they are looking at adapting to the various requirements of the learners or students or children in the class, you would get a better sense of and a better idea of how things are being planned and done by other colleagues. And that is where it helps in building, a collaborative relationship. Now, at the end of it, some of these tools and, when we look at different tools and how they provide feedback, they are going to be useful because they are going to help you adapt to your work setting. There would be supervision that is normally done, and that could be teaching observations, peer observations, and supervision and appraisals, which allows you to get feedback and then use that feedback to be able to make changes to your teaching practice so that it is more efficient, more dynamic, and more engaging, and thereby allowing learners to gain from the sessions that they do or learnings that they do when you're teaching them in a particular subject area. So I hope this is clear. Any questions on this? Feel free to ask me now. Okay. You can also ask me questions through the chat route. Now, the last assessment criteria in this particular learning outcome is about assessing the extent to which how your own practice can be inclusive, and that promotes, let's say, equality and diversity. Now, one of the things which we need to look at is when we talk about, inclusive teaching and learning. What do you mean by inclusive teaching and learning? So when we look at the aspect or the term, in this case, inclusive teaching and learning, this is an educational approach that prioritizes, the creation of diverse and supportive learning environment. That means you're ensuring that all students, regardless of their background, their identity, are given equal opportunities to participate and, obviously participate in the class or excel in their studies. Now, this approach is grounded on, certain theoretical frameworks. One is equality focused teaching, universal design of, for learning, UDL as we call it, the individual learning plans or ILPs as we call them. And then in terms of culturally responsible or responsive teaching. Now, in practical terms, inclusive teaching involves all the strategies that create accessible course materials, or, give your students and learners or children, essentially, whichever way you call them, student learners, children's professionals, it gives them that, let's say, accessibility to be able to get the course material or have the access to it. It also fosters a respectful and an inclusive classroom wherein you're looking at considering and taking along all the students, regardless of their background or, where they come from. And then you're also catering to their individual learning needs. And this would be recognizing the value of diversity that you have in your classroom, or when you do your sessions online, for example, in my case. And the whole idea of the inclusive teaching and learning is to maximize the potential of every student, that is doing a course or is studying with you. And when we look at this, what we are looking at is the aspect of now extending this to understand how does it inform my own practice, and how do I look at promoting this in a way wherein I am, making sure that I'm able to teach a diverse set of community within the classroom, or people within the classroom. I'm able to provide equal opportunities to all the learners in my classroom or in my sessions. And last but not the least, allowing and disregarding totally any sort of relevance or resemblance to any background or where people come from in terms of, the classroom arrangements that I do. So here, when we look at certain key areas, what we are looking at is making sure, first of all, starting with the content. That means our curriculum and our content are basically prepared in such a way that it does not, typecast or does not include any derogatory comments. So in this case, a better way of, if I rephrase this, in a better way of saying that would be to ensure that examples that I take, or the say, for example, the things that I use during the course of my lesson planning and then delivery at a later stage include a broader perspective, diverse variety of background in terms of, let's say, examples. And last but not the least, when I share experiences or examples, or, quote examples during the case of my discussions, I'm happy to include, examples which are coming from diverse backgrounds, and that would inform, me in particular, that my examples that I use in teaching and delivery are, essentially quite, not from a particular background or community, but are basically in general meeting, all taking into account different cultures, I'll put it this way, and backgrounds into the subject area. Now, the next thing that I would look at is, so an example that I would give you here is, when we look at, say, for example, taking an example of how my teaching informs my teaching practice. Now, in my class, sometimes I have learners which are from the Middle East, I have learners from the Indian subcontinent, I have learners from Far East, from Europe, European countries, and, from the UK as well. So when I take examples during the course of my teaching and learning in terms of my sessions, I normally would rotate examples from various organizations And in particular, when I go into a specific example, I would make sure that I'm able to talk about diverse cultures and a variety of examples rather than typecasting on any one particular type. And that would allow me that the practice that I'm looking at doing in terms of teaching is inclusive and is looking at not just taking an example from Africa or from Middle East or from Asia, but in general, using different ideas and different examples to be able to inform learners with the best possible content related to, say, in my case, HRM. Now, we also look at what are basically your pedagogy and instructional strategies. So when we talk about, the word pedagogy, and what does it mean? So pedagogy, when we look at, this is a word that you will come across umpteen number of times within the qualification. Now, pedagogy is basically, a term that refers to the methods of how teachers teach in theory and practice. And it is formed of my own teaching beliefs and concerns and how they interplay with cultural and different ways that I would look at promoting teaching and learning in a classroom or on an online session. So when I talk about pedagogy, in general, pedagogy is basically a set of methods, activities, theories that I use to inform and better plan my teaching and education when I do that in terms of its delivery. So here, this is a multidisciplinary field, and what it can do is it can be used to explore how knowledge and skills are imparted within an educational context. So that educational context would be a classroom environment, in this case, an online environment. It could be to use, say, for example, deliver boot camps, or when I do trainings specifically in other organizations, which are called boot camps, I would use those instructional strategies which are being informed in general by my thoughts, my beliefs, and also how I put them into practice when I'm in a particular setting or when I'm delivering a particular qualification or a particular lecture or a particular course or a qualification. So reflecting on some of my instructional strategies and teaching methods would help me consider things like where I've taught, how do I teach, what are the learning styles, what are my learners' abilities, do I have a diverse classroom, where are people coming from, and what are the cultural nuances of some of my learners that I need to be aware of and keep in mind to ensure that I'm able to have an inclusive practice as far as planning of teaching and learning is concerned. So in a classroom-based environment, what I look at is physical aspects, emotional aspects. I look at making sure that when I enter the class, I would normally greet all my learners, students, saying good morning, good afternoon, and I would be respectful to the other students. And that what also reflects when students greet back or respond back to me. I could look at making sure that the resources and the various things that I use in planning my lessons are adequate and they reflect on the aspects of diversity in order to make sure my teaching is inclusive. And then my use of language and communication skills in the classroom also informs that I am not going to be looking at stereotyping. I'm not going to be biased by my own beliefs, but I'm going to be open. And, let's say when I say open, what I mean by that is that I'm going to be having an open mind to be able to adapt and, change some of my delivery methods depending on what the learning styles of the learners are and what their comfort is in terms of teaching and learning. So when we look at classroom dynamics, we look at, classroom environment, we look at instructional strategies, we look at assessment and feedback. And in some cases, it would be a collaboration, because sometimes when I deliver lectures, I also have other colleagues who typically would act as a teaching assistant or help me in the preparation of delivering of a particular class or a session. And in those cases, I need to ensure that the classroom dynamics and relationships are in such a way that it allows the development of an inclusive learning environment, and thereby allowing learners to gain from the sessions that I'm actually conducting. So these things typically inform, that I look at inclusivity. And when I look at inclusivity, I also ensure that my, planning of lessons, when I talk about inclusive pedagogy, inclusive lesson planning, inclusive teaching, what I'm all referring to is a variety of activities which are going to be done and presented in a manner which is going to be different for each learners. And each of these learners would be able to use, adapt, and do some of these activities because it is meeting their requirement, their skill set, and that would inform that I, as a tutor, as a teacher, as an instructor, as a lecturer, is able to adapt my teaching and teaching techniques to meet the requirements and suit the needs of the learners in my session or in my class. Now, one of the things that I also want to emphasize here is when I look at my own practice being inclusive, we also look at to a certain extent, the aspect of personal development. What I need to be able to do is I need to also have a good understanding of the policies and procedures, things like the Equality Act, equality and diversity policy in my company. I need to look at understanding what is inclusive teaching and certain key concepts and theoretical frameworks which are compliance related, policy related, also you need to be aware of. And in some cases, when you join a new institution or a new place, what you're generally going to see is that these are going to be requirements which you need to be trained on, aware of, so that you can use them in practice, implement them in practice when you're actually teaching and delivering in a classroom or conducting online sessions. So the knowledge that you gain from some of these procedures, policies would be then put into practice. And that would, when I say put into practice, would mean it will better inform your own teaching and teaching techniques, thereby ensuring that learners are, let's say they are students or learners are all, say, for example, what I want to use is a word that students and learners are all ears to you, or in some cases, they are with you and they enjoy your sessions and obviously engage and interact with you. And thereby that helps you and them to be able to achieve their learning goals and objectives. And that is what would be done when I look at planning an inclusive lesson plan, when I look at inclusive learning, and when I look at inclusive classroom. And these are some of the key aspects that I need to look at when I talk about the extent to which I can use my own practice and make it inclusive, and then promote equality and diversity, which would make the learning a bit more collaborative, engaging, and interactive in my sessions. So I hope this is clear. And if you have any questions on this assessment criteria, please feel free to ask me now. Now, there are one or two bits which I want you to read in terms of further reading, which is an article on the Teaching English, which is exploring your own classroom practice, and the ultimate guide to reflective practice in teaching, which is a blog, but it talks about the 5 benefits of how you can encourage your colleagues and your teachers essentially to look at getting better by looking into reflective practice in teaching, reflective understanding the importance of reflective practice, and also how it can benefit you to become a better and effective teacher. So it is, although written in the form of a blog, but basically has a lot of useful points which are directly related to today's discussion of the learning outcome, which is knowing how to reflect on your own education and reflective practice. And I think these 2 articles would give you more information and knowledge about the topic that we have discussed in today's session, and will also shine a bit more light on the assessment criteria that we have covered in our discussion. So I hope you've enjoyed the session today and you've learned from me in terms of what is required to essentially reflect on your own education and your practice. We would be looking at meeting for the next session, and that would be on Wednesday next week, which will be covering learning outcome 3. And then the subsequent session after that would be looking at covering an assignment discussion. And what I would be also doing is providing a sampler assignment to basically discuss what would be the requirements once we complete this learning outcome 3 next week. So till then, if you think of any questions, feel free to write them to me at Learnerwork or at raman@ukversity.co.uk, and I will see you next week. Thanks for attending.